2 German Shepherd puppies had already been judged. One was too restless to follow commands, the other froze whenever a voice became too loud. Then they were placed inside the carefully ordered home of a Navy SEAL who believed discipline could fix almost anything. But on their first morning, one puppy hid beneath the table, while the other refused to cross a simple doorway. Why did both puppies fear the very man trying to help them? And what would happen when he realized their behavior was reflecting a mistake from his own past? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Early autumn rested lightly over Paulsbo, Washington, where a fine gray rain softened the roofs and blurred the evergreens beyond Liberty Bay. The morning carried no storm, only the patient tapping of water against windows and the distant complaint of gulls circling above the marina. Inside a cedar-sided house near the edge of town, Matthew Reed was already awake, dressed, and halfway through a life arranged so carefully that almost nothing had room to surprise him. Matthew was 41, a Navy SEAL instructor temporarily removed from training duties while an internal review examined an accident under his command. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with the powerful build of a man who had spent most of his adult life carrying more weight than anyone should have asked of him. His dark brown hair was clipped close, gray beginning to appear above both temples, and a neatly trimmed beard sharpened a face already made severe by a strong jaw and deep-set blue eyes. To strangers, Matthew seemed calm. To people who knew him, calm was not the correct word. Matthew was controlled. There was a difference. He rose every morning before dawn, ran precisely 6 miles, showered, shaved the edges of his beard, and prepared the same breakfast of eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee. His boots were aligned beneath the bench by the front door. His keys rested in a shallow wooden tray. At night, the lights went out at the same time whether he was tired or not. Order had once made him dependable. Lately, it had become the wall he built between himself and one unfinished memory. On the living room table stood an old wooden metronome with a brass pendulum. A Navy counselor had suggested it after Matthew began experiencing moments when his breathing shortened and his thoughts moved too quickly. The steady click gave his mind something simple to follow. He could slow his breath to match it, count the spaces between each sound, and return to the room instead of the training ground where Daniel Brooks had fallen. Daniel had been 34 at the time of the accident, 7 years younger than Matthew, with a lean, athletic frame, close-cropped black hair, and a stubborn streak that had once earned more respect than concern. He had been the kind of trainee who never admitted pain until his body admitted it for him. Matthew had admired that quality. That was part of the problem. The official report remained in a locked drawer in Matthew's study. It contained facts, measurements, weather conditions, equipment records, and witness statements. It did not contain every truth. At mid-morning, a vehicle door slammed outside. Matthew glanced toward the window. His younger sister was climbing the porch steps while carrying a plastic animal crate against her hip. Laura Reed was 37. Medium height and wiry, with pale skin scattered with freckles and dark blonde hair twisted into a careless knot. She wore navy blue veterinary scrubs beneath a rain jacket and moved with the hurried confidence of someone accustomed to frightened animals, anxious owners, and emergencies that ignored lunch breaks. Laura was compassionate, but not soft in the sentimental sense. She had learned that helping often meant cleaning messes, making unpopular decisions, and telling people truths they preferred not to hear. Matthew opened the door before she knocked. "No," he said. Laura looked at him over the top of the crate. "Good morning to you, too." A small black and tan head appeared behind the metal door, then another shoved beside it. Matthew stared. "Absolutely not." "The clinic's ventilation system failed." "Call a repairman." "We did. He can't get the replacement part until Monday." It was Thursday. Laura carried the crate inside before Matthew could object again. The moment she lowered it onto the living room floor, Two 10-week-old German Shepherd puppies began pushing against the door. The female was smaller, with fluffy black and tan fur, oversized paws, one ear standing and the other folding sideways, as though it had not yet chosen a direction. Her warm brown eyes moved constantly. Even inside the crate, she pawed at the latch, mouthed her brother's ear, and twisted around to investigate every sound. The male puppy was heavier through the chest, with a darker muzzle and two partially raised ears. He remained behind his sister, watching through the bars. His body was still, but his eyes were not. They tracked Matthew's boots, Laura's hands, the swinging pendulum of the metronome, and the open front door. "They need somewhere to stay for 3 days," Laura said. 3 days becomes 3 weeks whenever you say it. Only when you grow attached. I don't grow attached. Laura gave him a long look. That isn't the reassuring statement you think it is. The puppies had been transferred from a private working dog program that had recently closed after repeated violations of its care procedures. Neither puppy had serious physical injuries. Their problems appeared in behavior. The female rushed toward everything. The male withdrew from almost everything. The training program had described the female as uncontrollable and the male as unmotivated. Matthew disliked both words. They sounded imprecise. He also disliked the small movement inside him that recognized them. 3 days, he said. Laura smiled but wisely did not celebrate. Matthew prepared the house as he would have prepared for an inspection. He placed 2 identical crates along the living room wall, folded 2 blankets into equal squares, and set matching water bowls on a rubber mat. He found an old notepad and wrote feeding times, bathroom breaks, rest periods, and short training sessions. Laura watched from the doorway. They're puppies, Matt. They need consistency. They need patience. Consistency is patience with a schedule. That may be the saddest thing you've said this month. The female puppy proved Matthew's schedule useless within 7 minutes. The moment the crate opened, she shot across the rug, skidded beneath the coffee table, grabbed the corner of a folded throw blanket, and ran with it trailing behind her like a stolen flag. She collided with the table leg, recovered without shame, and discovered Matthew's left boot near the entryway. The male puppy stepped out more slowly. He remained near the crate, nose raised, testing the unfamiliar air. When Matthew moved too quickly to retrieve the blanket, the male lowered his body but did not run. By lunchtime, the female had overturned 1 water bowl, dragged a dish towel into the hallway, and hidden Matthew's left shoe beneath an armchair. She ignored the right shoe completely, as though even her crimes followed a private logic. Matthew found no humor in it. Laura did. You faced armed men with less irritation, she said. Armed men generally understand boundaries. The female puppy burst into the kitchen with the stolen shoe. The male followed until he reached the doorway. There he stopped. Matthew placed 2 bowls of softened puppy food several feet inside the kitchen. The female hurried toward them. The male remained behind the wooden threshold, head lowered. Come, Matthew said. The puppy did not move. Matthew crouched, keeping his voice firm but even. Come. The puppy's front paws shifted backward. He may not be refusing, Laura said quietly. He knows the food is there. Knowing what you want isn't the same as feeling safe enough to do it. Matthew disliked the sentence because it sounded as though it referred to more than a kitchen doorway. He moved the bowl closer. The puppy leaned forward, sniffed, then pulled back again. Matthew felt the familiar irritation of a problem failing to respond to the correct solution. In his old world, hesitation spread. One person's uncertainty could place an entire team at risk. He had built a career by teaching people to move when movement was required. He crossed into the living room and wound the metronome. Click, click, click. This helps establish rhythm, he said. Predictable sound, predictable movement. At the first click, the male puppy's ears flattened. At the second, his chest lowered toward the floor. By the 4th, his belly was pressed against the rug, and his eyes were fixed on the swinging brass arm. Matthew adjusted the tempo more slowly. The puppy did not relax. Laura reached past him and stopped the pendulum with one finger. Silence settled over the room. "You can't assume the thing that steadies you will steady everyone," she said. Matthew looked at her. "I said I'd keep them. I didn't ask for an assessment." "No, you rarely do." Laura gathered her rain jacket and checked both puppies before leaving. At the door, she took a cream-colored envelope from her bag and placed it beside the metronome. Matthew recognized Daniel Brooks's handwriting before he saw the return address. His shoulders tightened. "Daniel works with the Veterans Rescue Organization, considering support for our rehabilitation program," Laura said. "He'll be in Paulsbo soon." "How soon?" "A few weeks." Matthew touched neither the letter nor the metronome. After Laura left, he placed the envelope in the study drawer without opening it. The movement was calm and deliberate, as though concealing a letter could keep the past from entering the room. The rest of the day passed without obedience or disaster. The female puppy continued stealing small objects, although she eventually tired and collapsed beside the open crate. The male drank water only when Matthew moved to the far side of the room. He never crossed into the kitchen. Night came early beneath the rain clouds. Matthew left both crate doors open, turned off the lamps, and sat alone with the metronome ticking on the table. The female puppy circled twice inside one crate and settled on the blanket, one oversized paw hanging through the doorway. The male remained beneath the dining table. His eyes stayed open, and his body faced the nearest exit as though sleep were a risk he could not yet afford. Matthew watched the brass pendulum travel from side to side. Click, click, click. He reached forward and stopped it. In the silence, he understood that the puppies had not brought disorder into his house. They had only revealed how fragile his order had always been. Morning came, pale and damp over Paulsbo, with low clouds resting above Liberty Bay and rainwater shining along the cedar porch. The house smelled faintly of coffee, wet wood, and the unfamiliar warmth of two sleeping animals. Matthew Reed had been awake long before either puppy stirred. He had completed his 6-mile run, showered, trimmed the edges of his beard, and prepared breakfast according to the same routine he had followed for years. Yet the morning did not feel orderly. One of his shoes remained beneath the armchair, a damp towel lay forgotten in the hallway, and 2 stainless steel bowls waited on the kitchen floor like a problem he believed should have had an obvious solution. The female German Shepherd puppy woke first. She climbed out of the open crate with her black and tan fur flattened along one side and her half-folded ear pointing sideways. For several seconds she stood blinking at the room. Then life seemed to rush back into her all at once. She attacked the loose corner of the blanket, stumbled over her own oversized paws, and charged toward the kitchen when she smelled food. The male puppy emerged more carefully. He was broader through the chest than his sister, with a dark mask around the muzzle and 2 ears that had not yet decided whether to stand. He paused at every change in the floor, the rug, the wooden boards, the strip of tile near the kitchen. His movements had none of his sister's careless joy. Each step appeared negotiated with an invisible danger. Matthew carried the bowls to the center of the kitchen. He had divided the softened puppy food into equal portions and placed the bowls exactly 3 feet apart. Equality mattered to him. Equal food, equal space, equal expectations. It seemed fair. He did not yet understand that fairness was not always sameness. The female rushed forward before the bowls touched the floor. Matthew lifted them again. Sit. She bounced upward, front paws striking his knee. No, sit. The male remained outside the kitchen, head lowered. His nose moved toward the food, but his paws stayed behind the wooden threshold. Matthew repeated the command. The female spun in a tight circle, sat for less than a second, then sprang up again. He waited until her rear touched the floor and lowered one bowl. She lunged before he released her. Matthew raised it again. We wait. The puppy stared at the bowl, tail beating against the cabinet. Hunger made her frantic. Every time the food came close, she behaved as though it might vanish forever. Matthew interpreted her urgency as poor discipline. He did not ask what kind of past taught a 10-week-old animal that a meal had to be seized before someone changed their mind. The male puppy took one step toward the kitchen. Matthew noticed and pointed toward the second bowl. "Come." The puppy stopped. "Come on." The female barked sharply and jumped again. Matthew lowered her bowl, hoping the sight of his sister eating would encourage the male. Instead, the female buried her face in the food, swallowed several mouthfuls without chewing, then looked toward the untouched bowl across the room. The male still had not crossed the threshold. Matthew moved between them, but the female darted around his leg and raced toward her brother's meal. He caught the loose skin of her collar and pulled her back. "No!" The word cracked through the kitchen. The male puppy collapsed into a crouch, his back legs folded beneath him, and a dark puddle spread across the wooden floor. For one suspended moment, no one moved. The female twisted free, scrambled under the dining table, and pressed herself against her brother. The male followed backward without taking his eyes from Matthew. Their bodies touched from shoulder to hip, two small animals making themselves into one smaller target. Matthew stared at the urine spreading toward the edge of the rug. Something hot and unreasonable rose in him. It was not truly about the mess. It was about the ruined schedule, the untouched food, the failure of a simple instruction, and the humiliating fact that his voice had produced fear instead of obedience. He turned and struck the cabinet door shut with the flat of his hand. The bang was louder than he intended. Both puppies flinched so violently that the female's head struck the underside of the table. Silence followed. Matthew stood with one palm still resting against the cabinet. His breathing had shortened. His jaw ached from clenching it. He had not hit either puppy. The thought came quickly, almost defensively. He had not kicked them, dragged them from hiding, or thrown anything across the room. He had stopped himself. But looking beneath the table, Matthew understood how little that defense meant. A person did not become safe merely by avoiding the worst thing he could have done. Safety was not the absence of a blow. It was the presence of restraint before fear entered the room. The puppies did not know about his medals, his years of service, or the lives he had protected. They did not know that men had once trusted him in darkness, or that he had crossed oceans to bring teammates home. They knew only the large man standing between them and the exit, the voice that had become thunder, and the hand that had made the cabinet explode. Human beings often judged themselves by intention. Animals had the inconvenient habit of judging them by what actually happened. Matthew took a towel from the counter and knelt to clean the floor. He moved slowly, keeping his body turned sideways rather than facing the table. The female watched every motion. The male remained so still that only the movement of his ribs proved he was breathing. When the floor was clean, Matthew carried one bowl into the living room and placed it several feet from the table. He set the other near the far wall of the kitchen, then sat in a chair between neither of them. He folded his arms and waited. The female emerged after several minutes. Her belly stayed low, but hunger eventually overcame caution. She crept toward the bowl in the living room, glancing back at Matthew after every few steps. When he made no movement, she began to eat. The male did not follow. Matthew turned his chair slightly away. Still nothing. He stood, walked into the study, and closed the door halfway. Through the narrow opening, he saw the male puppy stretch his neck toward the kitchen bowl. The puppy waited, listening. Only after Matthew disappeared completely from sight did he crawl from beneath the table and begin eating. Matthew watched from the shadows of the study, ashamed of the relief he felt. The puppy was eating, but not because Matthew had taught him anything useful. He was eating because the danger appeared to have left. On the desk lay the cream-colored envelope Laura had delivered the previous day. Daniel Brooks's name stared up at him in dark blue ink. Matthew sat down and opened it. The letter was brief. Daniel did not accuse him of cruelty. He did not describe the injury, the months of rehabilitation, or the life that had changed afterward. He wrote that his organization would join the clinic's evaluation team in several weeks. Their task would be to determine whether the clinic's rehabilitation program deserved financial support. Daniel explained that his work now placed him beside veterans who struggled to trust their own bodies and rescue dogs that struggled to trust human hands. Both, he wrote, were often labeled difficult when they failed to recover according to someone else's schedule. The final lines were written with no anger Matthew could use as an excuse to dismiss them. "When we meet, I want to hear what actually happened, not what remained after the report was finished." Matthew lowered the letter. He remembered the training ground with painful clarity. Daniel's breathing had become uneven. His gloved hand had trembled against the equipment. He had said he could not continue. Matthew had heard him. The official report stated that Daniel had shown fatigue shortly before the accident. That sentence was technically true. It did not mention the warning. It did not mention Matthew's answer. Move forward. Those had been his words. He had not fabricated evidence. He had simply chosen which truth would survive on paper. By evening, the rain had become a thin mist against the windows. The female puppy had returned beneath the table after eating. The male had joined her, his body curved toward the wall. Matthew switched off the overhead lights and sat on the floor several feet away. He did not bring treats. He did not call them, reach toward them, or offer the open palm people often believed every frightened animal was obligated to accept. Minutes passed. The female's nose appeared first from the shadows. She crawled forward slowly, one paw at a time, until she was close enough to smell Matthew's fingers resting on the floor. Her nose touched the tip of his index finger. Then she retreated beneath the table. The male did not move. His eyes remained open in the darkness. Matthew stayed where he was. For most of his life, he had believed opening a door was the generous act. Standing aside and waiting had seemed passive, almost cowardly. That night he began to understand that a door could be wide open and still feel like a trap. The choice to cross it had to belong to the one who was afraid. 3 damp mornings passed over Paulsbo, each carrying the scent of wet cedar and salt water through the cracked kitchen window. By the 4th day, Matthew Reed's house no longer looked like a place arranged for one man. A folded blanket had migrated beneath the dining table. Small paw prints marked the hallway floor. His missing left shoe had been recovered from behind the sofa, damp around the laces and bearing several shallow tooth marks. The 2 German Shepherd puppies had begun to learn the boundaries of the house, but they had not learned to trust the person who enforced them. The female puppy moved through every room as though silence might catch her if she stopped. She stole dish towels, chased shadows, and inspected every object with her mouth. Her brother remained close behind whenever she moved, yet rarely chose a direction for himself. If she rushed forward, he followed. If she retreated, he vanished beside her. Matthew had mistaken their closeness for comfort. He had not considered that dependence could sometimes look like devotion. Laura arrived shortly after breakfast with rain shining on the shoulders of her veterinary jacket. She looked more tired than she had 3 days earlier. Several strands of dark blonde hair had escaped her knot, and the skin beneath her hazel eyes carried the faint grayness of too little sleep. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, and watched the female puppy race across the living room with a sock in her mouth. "The ventilation part is delayed," Laura said. Matthew removed the sock and placed it on a high shelf. "How delayed?" "At least another week, maybe longer." "You said 3 days." "I said that was the plan." Matthew looked toward the male puppy, who stood near the hallway wall and watched the exchange with his head lowered. "And the new plan?" Laura hesitated. 2 more weeks." Matthew laughed once without humor. "You knew this yesterday." "I knew it was possible yesterday. That isn't the same answer." Laura folded her arms. She had grown up with Matthew's silences, his corrected grammar, and the way he could turn disappointment into an interrogation without raising his voice. When they were children, their father had praised Matthew for being reliable and Laura for being kind. Neither compliment had been harmless. Matthew had learned that mistakes threatened his value. Laura had learned that saying no threatened hers. "If we can't stabilize them or find another placement," she said, "the clinic may have to transfer them to a larger facility in Seattle." The female puppy dropped the sock at Matthew's feet and barked once, apparently offended that no one had noticed her achievement. Matthew glanced down. "I'll keep them for 2 weeks on one condition." Laura waited. "I want a professional evaluation, not a form, not a 20-minute temperament test. Someone who understands working dogs." Laura nodded. "I know someone." That afternoon they drove to a fenced training field behind an old converted dairy barn north of town. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass dark and slick beneath a bright strip of sky. The property belonged to Sophia Martinez, a 55-year-old canine behavior specialist who had spent nearly 2 decades working with wilderness search and rescue teams across Washington and Oregon. Sophia was a compact woman with strong forearms, olive-toned skin, and thick black hair threaded with silver and braided down her back. A narrow scar crossed her right eyebrow, the souvenir of a mountain rescue in which falling stone had ended her field career, but not her work with dogs. She wore faded canvas pants, waterproof boots, and a green jacket with pockets full of treats, whistles, and folded notes. Her face was expressive but difficult to charm. Years of watching frightened dogs had taught her that people often used confidence to hide impatience and kindness to hide control. Sophia did not greet the puppies by leaning over them. She stood sideways, avoided direct eye contact, and allowed them to investigate the air around her. The female puppy approached first, nose working rapidly. She sniffed Sophia's boot, discovered a loose lace, and tried to pull it free. The male remained behind Matthew's leg. "Show me what you've been doing," Sophia said. Matthew attached a lightweight leash to each puppy. He asked them to walk beside him across the field. The female lunged toward a clump of wet leaves. The male followed because she moved, then stopped because Matthew tightened the leash. Matthew shortened both leads and repeated the command. "Together," he said. The female twisted after a bird landing near the fence. Her brother collided with her shoulder, recovered, and pressed closer to her side. Matthew tried again. After several uneven steps, both puppies became tangled around his boots. "They need more structure," he said. Sophia crouched several feet away. "They need less confusion." "They're litter mates. Separating them will increase anxiety." "Possibly. For a while." Matthew stared at her. "You say that as if it doesn't matter." "It matters. It just may not be the worst thing happening." Sophia asked Laura to take the male puppy behind a wooden screen at the edge of the field. The moment his sister disappeared, he lowered his body and began searching for her. Matthew reached for him, but Sophia stopped him. "Work with the female first." Without her brother beside her, the female puppy became even more restless. She pulled toward the fence, bit the leash, attacked a patch of leaves, and spun whenever Matthew tried to guide her. "She has no attention span," Matthew said. "She has plenty of attention," Sophia replied. "She's giving it to everything except you." Matthew's jaw tightened. Sophia scattered 3 pieces of food in the grass. The puppy's frantic motion changed immediately. Her nose lowered, her tail slowed. For several seconds she searched with complete concentration. "She fills every empty space," Sophia said. "Movement, sound, touch. She may have learned that being first is the only way to get what she needs." Next, Laura brought the male puppy forward while Sophia led the female behind the screen. The male resisted almost immediately, his eyes fixed on the place where his sister had disappeared. Matthew asked him to walk. The puppy did not move. Matthew waited, then applied light pressure to the leash. Still nothing. A metal feed pan slipped from a shelf inside the barn and struck the concrete floor with a hollow crash. The puppy's body became rigid. His ears flattened, his mouth closed, and his gaze lost focus. He did not pull away or bark. He simply stopped existing anywhere except inside his fear. Matthew mistook the stillness for refusal. "Come," he said, pulling the leash. Sophia caught his wrist before he could pull again. Her grip was firm but not aggressive. "Look at him." "I am looking at him." "No, you're looking at what he isn't doing." Matthew turned toward the puppy. The animal's paws were spread against the ground, nails pressing into the mud. His breathing had become shallow. Sophia released Matthew's wrist. "A dog frozen by fear can look very obedient. Quiet body, no resistance, no barking. People praise that kind of stillness because it makes life convenient. He needs to learn he can move past it. Eventually, but right now he isn't choosing not to move. He has stopped believing movement will help." Matthew loosened the leash. The male puppy remained rigid for several seconds. Then his eyes shifted toward Matthew, uncertain but present again. Sophia looked toward the wooden screen where the female puppy was scratching at the bottom. "The female uses chaos to take control of a room. The male uses silence to disappear from it. When they are always together, she makes every decision, and he never discovers that he can survive without following." "They calm each other," Matthew said. "Sometimes. They also hide each other." Laura stood near the fence with her hands buried in her jacket pockets. Her face had become unusually still. Matthew noticed. "What haven't you told me?" Laura looked at Sophia, then back at her brother. "The clinic's funding partner issued a deadline this morning. The puppies have 14 days to pass the standard behavioral assessment. And if they don't? The funding for their care is withdrawn." Matthew stared at her. "You knew there was a deadline when you asked me to keep them." "I learned the details yesterday." "You let me waste 3 days!" Laura's expression hardened. "They weren't wasted. I could have started separate training immediately. You would have doubled the pressure immediately." "You don't know that." "I watched you pull him because a frightened puppy wasn't progressing fast enough for you." The words landed harder because Sophia did not defend either of them. Matthew stepped closer to Laura. "You don't get to hide information and then blame my reaction." "I hid it because I knew exactly what your reaction would be." Her voice shook, but she did not lower it. "You hear a deadline and stop seeing whoever is standing in front of you. Everything becomes something to complete." The male puppy moved behind Matthew's leg. The female whined from the other side of the screen. For a moment, Matthew saw the entire field as a collection of failures. Laura's secrecy, the clinic's deadline, the puppy's behavior, Daniel's unopened history now living inside a letter on his desk. He wanted a plan severe enough to silence every uncertainty at once. Sophia handed him the 2 leashes. "Take them home. Separate meals, separate short sessions, separate rest periods. Not all day, just long enough to learn who each one is without the other answering first." That evening, Matthew placed 2 identical rubber toys on the living room rug. The female seized one, abandoned it, and rushed toward the toy her brother had chosen. The male held on. A low growl rose between them. Within seconds, paws tangled, teeth flashed, and both puppies rolled against the coffee table in a frightened, noisy struggle. Matthew separated them with a folded blanket and placed each puppy in a different crate. He moved one crate near the window and the other beside the hallway wall. The male whined softly, staring across the room. The female bit the corner of her blanket, shook it, and tore loose a strip of fabric. Matthew sat on the floor between them. Every instinct told him to move the crates together, stop the crying, and restore peace before the sound became unbearable. He did not. The puppies remained unhappy, so did he. Near dawn, the male's whining faded. The female released the ruined blanket and curled against the back of her crate. The room became quiet, but not because Matthew had forced it to be. For the first time, he accepted that distance was not always abandonment. Sometimes it was the small, uncomfortable space in which a living creature began to discover where another life ended and its own began. The week began beneath a low silver sky, with mist drifting across Liberty Bay and gathering on the windows of Matthew Reed's house. Inside, the living room had been divided into small territories. One crate stood near the hallway, the other beside the window. 2 bowls occupied separate corners. 2 leashes hung from different hooks. The arrangement looked less orderly than Matthew preferred, but it allowed each German Shepherd puppy to move without the other answering first. Sofia Martinez had left him with one instruction that irritated him precisely because it sounded simple. Stop trying to make both puppies succeed in the same way. Matthew began with the female puppy. Instead of asking her to remain seated while the world happened around her, he placed several pieces of food inside a cardboard box filled with crumpled paper. The puppy charged into the task with the enthusiasm of a burglar who had discovered an unlocked bank. Her black and tan head disappeared among the paper, her hindquarters wriggled in the air, and within seconds, she had overturned the box completely. Matthew's first impulse was to correct the mess. He caught himself before speaking. The puppy had found every piece of food. The next day, he hid a cloth carrying the scent of cooked chicken beneath one of 3 containers. The puppy raced between them, pawed the wrong one, bit the edge of another, then finally stopped and pressed her nose against the correct container. Matthew rewarded her immediately. By the 4th repetition, her frantic movement had narrowed into deliberate searching. She had never lacked attention. She simply possessed more of it than she knew where to place. Matthew also began teaching her to trade. Whenever she stole a sock, towel, or one of his increasingly endangered left shoes, he no longer chased her through the house. He showed her a rubber toy, waited until she released the stolen object, then offered the toy in exchange. At first, she tried to keep both. On one memorable afternoon, she wedged a dish towel beneath one paw while biting the rubber ring and staring at Matthew as though she had discovered a legal loophole. Despite himself, he laughed. The sound surprised both of them. The puppy froze, then wagged her tail and pounced on the towel again. Matthew realized how little laughter the house had held since his removal from duty. He had treated amusement as a loss of discipline, yet the puppy worked better when his voice carried warmth instead of judgment. Training the male puppy required something entirely different. Matthew stopped using the metronome, firm commands, and repeated invitations. Each morning he sat several feet from the kitchen doorway and placed a piece of food just beyond the wooden threshold. Then he waited. On the first morning, the puppy approached within 2 feet and stopped. His dark muzzle pointed toward the food, but his paws remained planted on the living room floor. Matthew said nothing. After several minutes, the puppy retreated beneath the table. The second morning, he reached the threshold but did not cross. The third morning, he stretched his neck into the kitchen, stole the food without moving his front paws, and backed away so quickly that he nearly fell. Progress measured in inches offended the part of Matthew that had spent years measuring success in completed missions. People admired patience most easily when they were not the ones required to practice it. From the outside, waiting looked gentle. From within, it could feel like helplessness wearing polite clothes. Sofia called each evening. She asked what the puppies had chosen, not what Matthew had made them do. He disliked the wording but began keeping separate notes. The female responded well to scent work, motion, and exchanges. The male relaxed when Matthew turned his body sideways, avoided direct staring, and left a clear path of retreat. By the end of the week, the male puppy could place both front paws across the kitchen threshold. Then Matthew received a message ordering him to attend a morning meeting at the naval facility. The internal review panel wanted clarification on several sections of his original training report. He dressed before sunrise in a pressed uniform, drank his coffee standing, and checked his watch more often than necessary. The puppies sensed the difference. The female followed him through the hallway trying to steal a glove from his hand. The male remained near the kitchen doorway. Matthew had 10 minutes before he needed to leave. He placed a piece of food just inside the kitchen and sat down. The male puppy approached slowly. One paw reached the threshold. His body tightened. Matthew checked his watch. "Come on," he said, more sharply than intended. The puppy did not move. Matthew imagined arriving late, walking into a room where officers would examine every sentence he had written, and appearing unreliable before people already deciding what kind of man he had become. The pressure inside him sought the nearest thing it could control. He reached down, took hold of the puppy's collar, and guided him forward. The pressure was light. The movement lasted less than a second. The puppy reacted as though the floor had opened beneath him. He twisted backward, claws scraping the wood, and struck his shoulder against the wall. Then he fled into the living room and disappeared behind the sofa. Matthew remained crouched beside the doorway. The piece of food sat untouched inside the kitchen. He told himself he had barely pulled. He had not hurt the puppy. He had only helped him complete a movement he had already begun. The defense sounded familiar. Matthew left for the meeting with a sentence lodged in his mind. I only pushed him through what he was already capable of doing. For the next 2 days, the male puppy refused to approach the kitchen. He ate in the living room and circled wide whenever Matthew stood near the doorway. A week of patient work had not vanished entirely, but its visible evidence had. Trust, Matthew learned, did not keep a fair account. 10 careful choices did not purchase permission for one careless act. On the second afternoon, Laura called from the clinic. Daniel arrived early, she said. Matthew looked toward the male puppy sleeping beneath the table. How early? He's here now. Daniel Brooks stood in the clinic's consultation room when Matthew arrived. It was the first time they had faced each other since the investigation began. Daniel was 34, tall but leaner than Matthew remembered, with close-cropped black hair, medium brown skin, and a narrow scar disappearing beneath the collar on the left side of his neck. His face had once been quick to smile, especially when teasing exhausted teammates. Now it appeared more guarded, the cheekbones sharper and the mouth held in a firm line. He favored his right leg slightly when he stood, though he made no attempt to conceal it. Daniel had always disliked being treated as fragile. The accident had not softened that dislike, it had sharpened it into something quieter and more exact. Matthew had prepared an apology during the drive. Daniel, I know what happened affected. Daniel raised one hand. Don't begin with what it did to you. Matthew stopped. Laura stood near the door but did not interrupt. Sophia sat at the far end of the table, her expression unreadable. Daniel rested both hands on the back of a chair. I'm not here to hear that you lost sleep. I'm not here so you can tell me you carry guilt every day. That may be true, but your suffering is not the center of what happened. Matthew felt heat rise beneath his collar. I wasn't trying to make it about me. You began with yourself. The room became painfully still. Daniel continued. My hand was shaking. I told you I couldn't continue. Why wasn't that in the report? Matthew looked at the scar near Daniel's collar rather than his eyes. The report noted fatigue. That wasn't my question. Matthew remembered the training ground, Daniel's uneven breathing, and his own certainty that hesitation had to be defeated before it spread. I thought you were panicking, Matthew said. I was. I believed you needed to move through it. Daniel's fingers tightened against the chair. You decided fear was the problem. You never considered that it might have been a warning. Matthew said nothing. Daniel's voice remained controlled, which made the words harder to escape. You didn't help me cross a limit. You decided for me that the limit wasn't real. The male puppy's reaction at the kitchen doorway returned to Matthew with unbearable clarity. The collar in his hand, the backward scramble, the certainty that a light pull could not count as harm. He had spent years judging pressure by how little force he used. He had rarely judged it by how little choice he left. Matthew returned home after dark. He did not attempt another kitchen exercise that evening. He placed the male puppy's bowl in the living room and allowed the house to remain unfinished. The following morning, rain whispered against the roof. Matthew sat several feet from the kitchen doorway. He carried no treats and gave no command. The stopwatch rested in his palm, though he did not press the button. The male puppy emerged from beneath the table. He approached the threshold, stopped, and looked at Matthew. Matthew turned his gaze toward the window. Minutes passed. The puppy placed one front paw across the wooden strip, then the second. He stood inside the kitchen, trembling slightly, free to remain or retreat. Matthew kept the stopwatch still. For the first time, a step became meaningful, precisely because no one had measured how long it took. Late Saturday morning opened, bright and cool over Paulsbo, with the previous week's rain washed from the sidewalks and sunlight trembling across Liberty Bay. The farmers' market near the waterfront had already filled with canvas stalls, baskets of apples, jars of honey, hand-knitted scarves, and neighbors who seemed to know one another's business before knowing one another's names. Matthew Reed arrived with the female German Shepherd puppy on a lightweight leash and a small notebook tucked into his jacket. He had left her brother at the veterinary clinic with Laura, not because the puppies had stopped needing each other, but because Sofia Martinez had insisted that neither animal could reveal an individual nature while constantly living inside the other's reactions. The female puppy stepped onto the crowded walkway and immediately attempted to investigate the entire market at once. Her half-folded ear bounced as she lunged toward a paper bag rolling in the breeze, then changed direction when a child passed carrying a pretzel. Before Matthew recovered the slack in the leash, she had shoved her nose beneath a vegetable cart, startled a patient old terrier, and wrapped the lead around the leg of a sign advertising pear preserves. Matthew apologized to the vendor while untangling her. The puppy noticed none of the social embarrassment she had caused. Animals rarely felt ashamed on behalf of their humans, which was perhaps one of their healthiest qualities. Matthew tried the methods that had worked inside the house. He offered a rubber ring in exchange for a stolen napkin. The puppy took the ring, dropped it, and pursued a stroller wheel. He asked for her attention, but the market was a kingdom of moving feet, rattling carts, food smells, laughter, gulls, and paper sacks. Every sound appeared to demand her immediate participation. Within 10 minutes, Matthew's shoulders had tightened. He heard the old judgment forming in his mind. Uncontrolled, unsuitable, too much. Those were not his words. They belonged to the training facility that had rejected her. Still, he had almost adopted them because labels were easier to manage than complicated living things. Near the apple stall, a tall cloth bag swung from a hook. Its fabric carried the sharp green scent of fruit. Matthew remembered how completely the puppy had focused during the scent boxes at home. He asked the vendor for permission to borrow the bag, rubbed a slice of apple against one corner, and allowed the puppy to smell it. Then he asked Laura, who had just arrived with supplies for another clinic booth, to hold the puppy while he hid the bag beneath an empty wooden crate several stalls away. The puppy saw Matthew return without the bag and exploded forward when Laura released the leash. At first, she followed the path of every smell except the right one. He investigated roasted meat, a dropped muffin crumb, and the leather boots of a man who had not volunteered for inspection. Then her nose caught the apple scent. The frantic pulling changed, her head lowered, her pace slowed, and her movements became purposeful. She ignored a child running past and followed the invisible trail between the stalls until she reached the wooden crate. She scratched once, looked up at Matthew, and waited. It was the longest she had remained still all morning. Matthew rewarded her and felt something inside his assumptions quietly break apart. The puppy had not lacked attention. She had been drowning in too many possible places to put it. Once given a question her mind understood, the chaos gathered itself into direction. Matthew repeated the exercise 3 times. Each search became calmer. By the final attempt, the puppy passed a bag of grilled sausages without abandoning the trail, an achievement Matthew considered more impressive than certain military exercises he had witnessed. That afternoon, he took the male puppy to Harbor Shelf Books, a narrow, independent bookstore 2 streets uphill from the marina. Its front windows were crowded with faded novels, model sailboats, and handwritten recommendations from the owner. A small group of veterans met in the back room twice a month, where donated armchairs surrounded a scratched wooden table, and nobody was required to discuss service unless they chose to. Daniel had suggested the location because it offered low voices, predictable movement, and several clear exits. The male puppy entered with his belly low and his dark muzzle close to the floor. A bell chimed above the door. He stopped but did not freeze. Matthew waited until the puppy moved again before following him deeper inside. 6 men and 2 women occupied the back room. Most greeted Matthew with nods rather than questions. Among them was Walter Hale, a 73-year-old retired high school librarian and former Navy radio operator. Walter was tall but stooped, with narrow shoulders, dark skin marked by age, and a full white beard trimmed close to his jaw. Thick glasses enlarged his gentle brown eyes. A stroke 5 years earlier had slowed his speech and weakened his left hand, but it had also ended his lifelong habit of rushing to fill silence. Walter now spoke as though every sentence had been examined for unnecessary weight. He did not call the puppy, slap his knees, or offer a hand. He simply continued reading aloud from a battered collection of sea stories, his voice low and steady, pausing naturally between paragraphs. The puppy crawled beneath Matthew's chair. From there, he watched shoes shift across the rug and listened to cups being placed on the table. Matthew resisted the urge to coax him out. After 20 minutes, the puppy stretched his neck toward Walter's voice. 10 minutes later, he left the shelter of the chair and moved several feet across the room. Walter did not look down. He turned a page and continued reading. The puppy stopped near the edge of the old man's boot, circled once and lay down with space still between them. Matthew wrote the observation in his notebook. Approached by choice, responded to low, continuous speech, remained near unfamiliar person without contact. The clinical language was accurate, but it failed to capture what Matthew saw. The puppy had not suddenly become brave. He had simply found someone who did not make courage the price of remaining in the room. Daniel began building the clinic's alternative assessment that same week. He rejected the idea that a dog's future could be decided during a single stressful session. His model recorded behavior over several days, in quiet rooms, public spaces, unfamiliar surfaces, and controlled noise. It also required evaluators to document what happened before a reaction rather than describing only the reaction itself. Matthew offered to organize the field notes. Daniel considered him for a long moment before agreeing. "You can help with the records," he said. "That does not mean we are repaired." Matthew nodded. Once he might have argued that cooperation itself proved progress. Now he understood that people often demanded forgiveness because uncertainty made them uncomfortable. Daniel did not owe him comfort. They spent an afternoon inspecting a possible training space above an unused section of the clinic. Daniel walked with a slight shift away from his injured right leg, more visible after climbing the first flight of stairs. On the way down, his hand tightened around the rail. Matthew moved instinctively, one arm lifting to support him, but stopped before making contact. Daniel noticed. Matthew asked, "Do you want help?" Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment the old tension returned between them. "No." Matthew stepped back far enough to leave the landing clear. Daniel descended slowly without assistance. There was no gratitude afterward, no meaningful glance to reward Matthew for basic restraint. That absence mattered. Respect was not a performance that guaranteed applause. That evening, both puppies rested in the living room after separate outings. Matthew sat between them with the notebook open. The female puppy had transformed motion into work when given a scent to follow. The male puppy had entered a room of strangers when allowed to choose distance and pace. Neither animal matched the descriptions attached to their old records. One was not too much, the other was not too little. They had merely been asked to succeed in roles designed without knowing them. Matthew looked at the female puppy, who had entered his life like a shrill, unexpected note and refused to apologize for being heard. "Piper," he said. Her half-folded ear lifted. He turned toward the male puppy. He wanted a name that did not sound sharp enough to be mistaken for an order. "Milo." The darker puppy blinked at him, but remained where he was. Matthew took the wooden metronome from the shelf. He wound it gently and set the pendulum at its slowest pace. The first click caused Piper to tilt her head. The second made Milo step backward. Matthew stopped the pendulum immediately. He did not move the machine closer. He did not scatter food around it or decide Milo needed to become accustomed to the sound. Some fears could be approached later. Some might never need to be conquered at all. Matthew returned the metronome to the shelf and walked toward the kitchen doorway. He looked back at the two puppies. Piper, Milo. Piper came first, tail swinging. Milo paused, looked toward the silent metronome, and then followed at his own pace. For the first time, they were not moving because a leash pulled them or because one puppy had chosen for both. They were answering sounds that finally belonged to them. A clear Sunday settled over Paulsbo, the kind of bright coastal morning that made every porch, garden fence, and white sailboat seem recently washed. Inside Matthew Reed's house, Piper was dragging a braided rope through the hallway, while Milo watched from the living room rug, his dark ears tilted toward the unfamiliar vehicle turning into the driveway. The puppies were nearly 12 weeks old now. Piper's black and tan coat had grown thicker around her shoulders, and her once folded ear stood upright for longer stretches before collapsing sideways again. Milo had become taller through the legs, though his caution still made him appear smaller than he was. Matthew had spent days learning what steadied each puppy. That morning, strangers were coming to decide whether they could offer something better. Laura arrived first with 2 folders tucked beneath one arm. She wore clean veterinary scrubs and had brushed her dark blonde hair into a low ponytail, but the deepening shadows beneath her hazel eyes suggested the clinic's problems had followed her home each night. She set the folders on the dining table and reminded Matthew that these were only introductory meetings. No decision had to be made immediately. Matthew heard caution in her voice and interpreted it as mistrust. "I know how adoption works," he said. Laura looked toward the 2 carefully arranged water bowls and the handwritten schedules attached to the refrigerator. "You know how evaluation works. Adoption is messier." The first applicants arrived in a polished blue sport utility vehicle with 2 mountain bicycles mounted on the roof. Evan and Claire Dawson were both 29, newly married, and dressed as though they had come directly from an outdoor clothing advertisement. Evan was tall and lean, with sandy hair, a narrow blonde beard, and an easy smile that appeared whenever he believed he was making a good impression. He worked remotely in software sales and spoke enthusiastically about trails, fitness goals, and building an active lifestyle. Claire was petite and athletic, with smooth brown skin, long black hair pulled through the back of a baseball cap, and quick dark eyes that missed very little. She was a physical therapist who genuinely cared about animals, but years of planning every achievement, from college to marriage to their first house, had taught her to confuse preparation with certainty. Piper greeted them by launching herself toward Evan's bootlaces. Evan laughed. "That's the energy we're looking for." Claire crouched and called Piper closer. Piper approached, sniffed her hands, then twisted around to investigate the strap hanging from Claire's backpack. "We hike almost every weekend," Claire explained. "Mount Eleanor, the Cascades, sometimes longer trips when work allows." "She won't be ready for long hikes while she's growing," Matthew said. "Of course," Claire replied quickly. "We've read about joint development." Matthew noted the prepared answer. He also noticed that Evan kept trying to position Piper between them while Claire held up her phone. "Can you get her to sit?" Evan asked. Matthew gave Piper a hand signal. She sat for half a second, spotted the moving backpack strap, and lunged. Claire laughed, though the sound carried strain. "Let's try again." Piper sat, rose, turned sideways, and attempted to climb into Claire's lap. Evan repositioned her by the shoulders. Piper wriggled free. "Maybe hold her collar," he suggested. Matthew's jaw tightened. "She isn't a prop." Evan blinked. "I didn't mean it like that." They tried one more photograph. Piper noticed a decorative cord loop through the front of Evan's backpack, seized it, and pulled. The thin cord snapped. A metal bottle fell against the floor with a sharp clang. Milo retreated behind Matthew's chair. Piper shook the broken cord with great satisfaction. Evan's smile vanished. She really hasn't been taught much, has she? Matthew took the cord from Piper through an exchange with her rubber ring. She has learned a great deal. Claire touched Evan's arm, but her expression had changed too. She looked less concerned about the broken cord than about the possibility that Piper would not fit the future she had already imagined. "We were hoping for a dog who could grow into our routine," she said carefully. "You were hoping for a dog who already understood the photographs," Matthew replied. Laura stepped in before the conversation hardened further. She explained Piper's scent work ability, her need for structured activity, and the amount of training a young German shepherd would require. The couple listened politely, but their enthusiasm had cooled. They left with the application still incomplete. Piper watched the vehicle disappear, then dropped the broken cord at Matthew's feet, as if presenting evidence that she had solved the meeting correctly. The second applicant arrived that afternoon in an older gray sedan. Thomas Greer was 52 and lived alone in a carefully maintained condominium on the edge of town. He was a broad, heavy-set man with thinning auburn hair, pale skin, and a square face kept clean-shaven, except for a narrow mustache. His beige sweater, pressed trousers, and polished shoes made him look more suited to a bank office than a room with puppies. Thomas had spent 26 years managing insurance claims, a profession that rewarded caution and suspicion. His wife had left 2 years earlier, after a long marriage in which both people had gradually learned to avoid difficult conversations. Since then, Thomas had wanted companionship, though he described the desire in practical terms: security, routine, and a reason to walk every evening. He ignored Piper almost immediately and watched Milo resting beside the sofa. "That one seems calm," Thomas said. "He's quiet right now," Laura replied. "That isn't always the same thing." Thomas sat and patted his knee. Milo did not approach. "I don't need an excitable dog," he said. "I like that he waits." Matthew glanced at Laura. He had learned enough to recognize the mistake. Thomas pulled a set of keys from his pocket. They slipped from his fingers and struck the wooden floor. Milo froze, his mouth closed, his body stiffened, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the room. Thomas leaned back. "What's wrong with him?" "He's frightened," Matthew said. "Of keys? Of the sound." Thomas waited for Milo to recover. When the puppy did not move, disappointment settled across his face. "I need a stable dog, something quiet and manageable, not one that falls apart over ordinary noises." Matthew felt the anger arrive before he could examine it. He didn't fall apart. He stopped because something scared him. Thomas frowned. "That seems like a generous interpretation. And manageable seems like a generous word for easy to control." Laura said Matthew's name in warning. Thomas stood, face reddening. "I came here in good faith." "So did Milo." The meeting ended soon afterward. Thomas left without taking the folder Laura offered him. Milo remained motionless until the car had disappeared, then slowly moved toward the hallway. Over the following 2 days, Matthew reviewed the remaining applications. A family with 3 children was too noisy. A retired couple had a yard he considered too small. A nurse worked 12-hour shifts. A widower lived too near a busy road. A teacher owned a cat. Each concern held some truth, but together they formed a wall no applicant could cross. Laura found him at the dining table, surrounded by rejected forms. "You've eliminated everyone," she said. "They aren't suitable." "All of them?" "They don't understand the puppies." "No one will understand them as well as the person who has lived with them for 2 weeks. Then maybe that person should decide." Laura pulled out a chair, but did not sit. "You aren't looking for good homes anymore. You're looking for proof that no home can be good enough." Matthew pushed one folder away. "I'm protecting them." "From what? People who might make mistakes?" "People who want an idea of a dog, not the dog standing in front of them." That was true of the people today. It may not be true of everyone. Matthew looked toward the living room. Piper was asleep upside down inside her crate, paws against the bars.
Milo lay near the hallway, close enough to see Matthew but far enough to leave if voices rose. Laura followed his gaze.
You're afraid the house will be quiet again. That has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with this. Matthew stood. You brought them here because you needed somewhere to put them. Now you're treating them like files you need cleared from your desk. The accusation struck Laura hard enough to change her expression. She had taken responsibility for more animals than the clinic could afford, because saying no felt too much like abandonment. Matthew knew that. He used it anyway. Laura placed both unsigned adoption forms on the table. Keeping them because you're afraid of being alone isn't protection. It's asking them to heal a loneliness you still won't name. She walked out before Matthew could answer. Later that evening, Daniel arrived with the decision from the funding organization. The alternative assessment had been rejected as too expensive and too slow. Piper and Milo would have to complete the standard behavioral test at the end of the week. If they failed, the clinic would lose financial support for their care, and they would be transferred so the remaining animals could continue receiving treatment. Matthew looked at the adoption forms. I could sign these tonight. Daniel lowered himself into a chair, favoring his injured leg after the walk from the driveway. You could? That would keep them here? Yes. You think I shouldn't? I think you want me to give you permission. Matthew's eyes hardened. You know what happens if they fail. I do. Then what would you do? Daniel looked toward Piper and Milo. A decision can be generous and still be wrong. Guilt is not a home. Fear of losing something is not a home either. After Daniel left, Matthew sat alone at the dining table. He did not sign the forms. Instead, he opened his notebook and drew a line down the center of 2 separate pages. On Piper's page, he wrote, scent games, movement, trades, time to settle after excitement, no forced stillness for display. On Milo's page, he wrote, low voices, clear exits, warning before metal sounds, space from strangers, help offered but not imposed. He recorded when each puppy needed support and when the wiser choice was to step away. Near midnight, Piper walked into her crate without being directed and curled around the rubber ring. Milo crossed the room and lay beside Matthew's chair, not touching his feet but close enough to feel their warmth. They had chosen different places. Matthew looked at the unsigned papers and understood that loving 2 creatures did not require turning them into a pair that could never be separated. It did not require keeping them in his house so they could protect him from its silence either. The final assessment arrived beneath a hard coastal wind that swept rain across Paulsbo in silver sheets. By morning, the clinic's converted training warehouse smelled of damp wood, disinfectant, and cold metal. The building had once stored fishing equipment, and although Laura's team had painted the walls and covered most of the concrete floor with rubber mats, the place still carried the echo of chains, sliding doors, and hollow spaces. Matthew stood near the entrance with Piper on one leash and Milo on the other. Piper shifted constantly, her black and tan body trembling with unused energy. Milo stayed close to Matthew's leg, staring at the narrow metal walkway positioned in the center of the room. Neither puppy knew that a group of adults had gathered to decide whether their fear and excitement were acceptable enough to deserve more time. Sofia Martinez had designed the safest version of the required assessment, though she had not chosen its rules. Her silver-threaded braid rested over one shoulder, and the scar crossing her right eyebrow seemed deeper whenever she frowned. She inspected every station herself, checking the latches, sound levels, and spacing between obstacles. Sophia believed tests could reveal useful information, but only when the people conducting them remembered that measurement was not the same as truth. The representative from the funding organization stood beside Laura with a clipboard held tightly against her chest. Marianne Cole was 48, tall and slender, with fair skin, straight ash-brown hair cut at her jaw, and narrow gray eyes behind rimless glasses. She wore a dark wool coat over a cream blouse, and practical low-heeled shoes that remained perfectly clean despite the rain outside. Marianne had spent finished 15 years managing grants for animal welfare programs. She was not cruel, and she did not dislike frightened dogs. Her weakness was more ordinary. She trusted systems because systems allowed her to distribute limited money without carrying every painful outcome home. Years earlier, Marianne had tried to save a small rural shelter by making exceptions for every difficult case. The shelter collapsed beneath debt 6 months later, and more than 40 animals had to be transferred at once. Since then, she had believed consistent rules were the closest thing compassion had to a backbone. "We'll evaluate each puppy independently," Sophia said. "No forced physical contact. If either puppy becomes overwhelmed, the handler stops." Marianne glanced at the printed standards. "The protocol allows 3 attempts." "The protocol allows them," Sophia replied. "It does not require them." Matthew was instructed to remain outside the marked assessment area. He handed Piper's leash to Sophia first. Piper looked back at him, surprised, then followed Sophia toward a square marked with yellow tape. Around it sat brightly colored toys, open food containers, a rolling cart, and 3 unfamiliar volunteers, instructed to walk past without touching her. The first task appeared simple. Piper had to remain seated for 30 seconds while distractions moved around her. Sophia raised one hand. Piper sat. A volunteer rolled the cart past. Piper stood, followed it for 2 steps, then returned when Sophia guided her back. On the second attempt, a rubber ball bounced across the floor. Piper's ears lifted, her body launched forward, and the leash tightened before she reached it. Marianne made a mark on her form. Matthew watched Piper's tail continue wagging. The puppy was not distressed. She was trying to understand why every interesting object in the room had suddenly become forbidden. At the market, her attention had sharpened once given a scent to follow. Here, success required her to ignore the very world her mind was built to investigate. On the third attempt, Piper held the sit for 11 seconds. Then one of the volunteers opened a paper food bag, and the crackling sound sent her spinning toward it. "Failure to maintain position," Marianne said quietly. "She recovered each time," Laura replied. "The standard measures duration." Matthew felt irritation rise in him, but he remained behind the line. Milo's station waited at the far end of the warehouse. A narrow path led across sections of rubber, plywood, wire mesh, and ribbed metal. Small speakers were positioned along the wall to produce controlled household sounds. Sophia brought Milo forward slowly, allowing him to inspect each surface before stepping onto it. Milo crossed the rubber mat without difficulty. He hesitated at the plywood, sniffed it, then followed Sophia. At the wire mesh, his paws spread and his head lowered. Sophia waited. After several seconds, he crossed. Matthew's shoulders loosened slightly. Then a gust of wind struck the outer wall. The warehouse's old side door had not been fully secured. It swung several inches and slammed shut with a violent metallic crash. Milo froze. At the same instant, Piper barked from across the room. She lunged toward Milo, struck the end of her leash, spun around, and began biting the nylon strap. Dust rose beneath her paws as she circled. Sophia immediately raised her hand. "Stop the assessment!" Marianne looked toward the door. "That sound was not part of the test." "Which makes their reactions more useful, not less," Laura said. "The protocol requires recovery observation." Milo's body had become rigid on the metal surface. His mouth was closed, his ears flat, and his eyes no longer tracked the people around him. Piper continued twisting against the leash, her breathing loud and rapid. Sophia moved to lead Milo away, but the second evaluator consulted the printed sheet and asked her to wait 30 seconds before intervening. Marianne did not order the continuation, yet she did not stop it either. She watched the clock because the rules gave her something to hold while 2 frightened animals struggled in front of her. Matthew crossed the yellow line. "Matthew?" Laura warned. He took Milo's leash from Sophia and reached for Piper's with his other hand. The familiar instinct returned before thought could interrupt it. A problem existed, people were watching. The task had to be completed before the moment became a public failure. He tightened both leashes. "Piper, settle." Piper pulled harder. "Milo, come." Milo did not move.
Matthew increased the pressure and raised his voice. "Come!" Piper barked sharply and threw herself sideways. Milo's legs remained locked, but something in his gaze disappeared. He no longer looked frightened in the ordinary way. He looked absent. For a few terrible seconds, the warehouse became another training ground.
Matthew saw Daniel's gloved hand trembling against a piece of equipment. He heard Daniel say he could not continue. He remembered the faces of the observers, waiting for Matthew to prove that his team could finish what it had begun. He remembered believing that stopping would expose weakness in Daniel, in the exercise, and most of all in himself. Matthew had once thought an unfinished task was the worst possible outcome. Now Piper was choking against a leash while Milo stood beyond resistance, and every adult in the room was discussing procedure as though the puppies were not already answering the only question that mattered. Matthew released the tension. The leashes dropped loose against the floor. "End the test," he said. Marianne glanced at the form. "We still need to document whether they recover within—" "No. The funding decision depends on a completed assessment." "Then document that I stopped it." Matthew lowered himself onto the dusty floor. He did not call either puppy. He turned his body sideways, rested his hands on his knees, and waited. Milo moved first. His eyes focused slowly. One paw shifted on the metal surface, then another. He stepped off the walkway, crossed the strip of rubber, and stopped several feet from Matthew. Matthew did not reach for him. Milo closed the remaining distance and leaned lightly against Matthew's thigh. Piper took longer. Sophia had released her leash, giving her room without allowing her to flee the building. The puppy circled twice, shook dust from her coat, then paced toward the door and back again. Her breathing gradually slowed. At last she approached Matthew, dropped the chewed leash beside his boot, and collapsed near his other knee. Neither puppy looked victorious. Milo trembled. Piper panted with her tongue hanging sideways, dust coating her muzzle and chest. Matthew placed one hand on the floor between them, available but not imposed. The test ended there. Before the results meeting, Matthew found Daniel in the clinic's records room. Daniel stood beside a filing cabinet, one hand resting on the metal surface to take pressure from his injured leg. Matthew gave him a sealed document. "What is it?" Daniel asked. "A corrected statement." Daniel opened it and read in silence. Matthew had written everything the first report had avoided. Daniel's shaking hand, the warning he had spoken, Matthew's awareness of his panic, and the direct order to continue despite it. The statement did not blame faulty equipment, stress, or the culture of training. Those things had contributed, but Matthew had made the decision. "This could end your chance of returning to instruction," Daniel said. "I know." Daniel folded the pages. "Would you still send it if I told you I would never forgive you?" Matthew looked at him fully. "The truth can't depend on the reward I get for telling it." Daniel gave no answer. He did not offer his hand or remove the distance between them. He only placed the statement back into the envelope and returned it to Matthew. The results meeting lasted 12 minutes. Piper had failed the impulse control requirements. Milo had failed the environmental recovery requirement. Marianne announced that the funding organization would not continue paying for their rehabilitation. Her voice remained professional, but a small crease appeared between her eyebrows when Laura lowered her head. "The decision applies to the assessment standard," Marianne said. "It is not a judgment that the puppies have no value." Matthew looked at the forms on the table. "It will decide where they go." Marianne did not argue. Matthew took out the 2 unsigned applications Laura had left at his house. He placed them beside the separate care plans he had written for Piper and Milo. "I'm applying for a 6-month foster to adopt placement for both puppies," he said. "Separate training plans. Continued supervision from Sophia. Monthly behavioral reports to the clinic." Laura studied him. "Are you doing this because they failed today?" "No." "Because you feel responsible?" "I am responsible. That isn't the same as being ready." Sophia looked down at the care plans. "And are you ready?" Matthew glanced through the open doorway. Piper was pulling a cardboard tube from a recycling bin, while Milo watched from beneath a chair. They were not fixed. They were not symbols of Matthew's redemption. They were two young dogs with different needs, uncertain futures, and no obligation to make him feel like a better man. "I want the chance to prove my house can become a place where they're allowed to choose," he said. No one called it a rescue. This time, Matthew did not either. 6 months later, spring returned to Paulsbo quietly. First as softer rain, then as pale green buds along the shore of Liberty Bay. The cedar house near the water still belonged to Matthew Reed, but it no longer obeyed him in quite the same way. A rubber scent toy rested beside the neatly aligned boots. 2 water bowls occupied different corners of the kitchen. A blanket had been dragged halfway beneath the dining table, and one left shoe was missing again. Matthew found it behind the sofa, where Piper was attempting to remove the laces with the solemn concentration of a surgeon performing delicate work. She was nearly 9 months old now, long-legged and athletic, with a thick black and tan coat and both ears finally standing, except when she was tired, when the left one tilted sideways, as if even adulthood required occasional negotiation. Matthew held up a rubber ring. Piper looked at the ring, looked at the shoe, and appeared to consider the market value of each object. After several seconds, she released the shoe, accepted the ring, and trotted away with the satisfaction of a skilled businesswoman who had negotiated favorable terms. Milo had grown into a taller, darker young German shepherd, with a broad chest, watchful brown eyes, and a quiet way of entering rooms as though asking permission from the air. He still disliked sudden metallic sounds. When Matthew dropped a spoon during breakfast one morning, Milo's body tightened and his ears flattened. 6 months earlier, he would have frozen in place, unable to move toward safety or away from danger. Now he turned, crossed the kitchen, and settled on a padded mat near the hallway, where he could see the room without being surrounded by it. Matthew did not follow him with treats or praise. He did not turn Milo's retreat into a training opportunity. He simply picked up the spoon, placed it gently in the sink, and continued making breakfast. Milo returned when he was ready. The official adoption papers arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Laura brought them to the house after her shift, still wearing navy veterinary scrubs beneath a faded green jacket. Her freckles stood out against skin made pale by several sleepless weeks, but the weariness in her face was softened by cautious satisfaction. She placed the documents on the dining table beside the separate care plans Matthew had continued updating throughout the foster period. Piper's plan included scent work, structured movement, exchange games, and recovery time after crowded environments. Milo's listed predictable routines, clear exits, controlled introductions, and permission to withdraw without being pursued. The 2 plans did not match because the 2 dogs did not match. That simple fact would once have troubled Matthew. He had believed fairness meant giving everyone the same tools, the same time, and the same expectation. Now he understood that sameness could become its own kind of neglect when it ignored who stood in front of him. Laura watched him sign both forms. "You're certain?" Matthew glanced into the living room. Piper was trying to fit an entire cardboard tube into her mouth. Milo lay near the window, watching rain travel down the glass. "No," he said. Laura raised an eyebrow. "I'm prepared. That's different." She smiled faintly. "Better answer." The foster period had not transformed Matthew into a patient man in every part of his life. He still became irritated when plans changed. He still corrected people before asking what they meant. On difficult mornings, his voice sharpened before he noticed it. And once, after Piper shredded a packet of important notes, he had gone outside and stood in the rain, because leaving the room was the safest decision he could make. Growth had not arrived like a medal pinned neatly to his uniform. It came in interruptions, in the moment between anger and action, in the question asked before a hand reached out, and in the willingness to admit that restraint sometimes looked less heroic than command. The corrected statement concerning Daniel's accident had ended Matthew's chance of returning to his former instructional position. The review concluded that he had failed to document a critical warning, and had continued an exercise after a trainee reported being unable to proceed safely. Matthew retained his rank and remained in service, but the Navy reassigned him to a group responsible for revising training safety procedures and evaluating psychological responses during high-pressure exercises. At first, the position felt like exile disguised as administrative work. Matthew spent his days reviewing reports, sitting through meetings, and writing stop criteria for instructors who believed good judgment could not be reduced to paper. It was not the future he had imagined. No one saluted a paragraph. No one told stories about the man who improved a checklist. Then Matthew reviewed a proposed exercise in which participants would be expected to continue after showing several signs of disorientation. The old version described those signs as resistance. Matthew changed the language. He required an immediate pause, an independent assessment, and the participants' clear agreement before the exercise resumed. Several instructors objected that trainees would learn to escape difficult tasks by appearing overwhelmed. Matthew recognized the argument because he had once believed it. He answered that a system unable to distinguish avoidance from genuine distress had no right to punish either one blindly. For the first time, his mistake was doing more than haunting him. It was standing between someone else and the same mistake. The clinic's future remained less certain. Daniel's Veterans Organization agreed to finance a 6-month trial of the alternative behavioral assessment. Instead of deciding an animal's future during one short test, the program recorded behavior across several days and environments. Evaluators documented what happened before a reaction, how long recovery took, which forms of support helped, and whether the animal had been offered a genuine choice. Piper and Milo became the first completed records in the program, not because either had become an ideal dog, but because both demonstrated how Daniel's Veterans Organization agreed to finance a 6-month trial of the alternative behavioral assessment. Instead of deciding an animal's future during one short test, the program recorded behavior across several days and environments. Evaluators documented what happened before a reaction, how long recovery took, which forms of support helped, and whether the animal had been offered a genuine choice. Piper and Milo became the first completed records in the program, not because either had become an ideal dog, but because both demonstrated how badly a single label could misrepresent a living creature. Piper had once been called uncontrollable, yet she could follow a scent trail through a busy space while ignoring food and movement around her. Milo had been called unmotivated, yet he crossed unfamiliar surfaces when given time and a clear route back. The program's first months were not an easy triumph. It required more staff hours than expected. Several applicants complained about the detailed adoption process. One dog behaved well during observation and struggled after placement. Another showed such severe fear that the clinic had to admit it lacked the resources to provide everything he needed. Compassion did not turn every ending into success. Sometimes it only made failure more honest. Daniel and Matthew worked together on the program without becoming friends. Daniel remained courteous, direct, and careful about distance. He never said he had forgiven Matthew. Some days they reviewed reports at the same table and spoke only about the work. Other days, Daniel challenged a phrase Matthew had written because it placed too much responsibility on the animal and too little on the handler. Matthew no longer treated disagreement as an attack on his authority. He listened, revised the sentence when Daniel was right, and defended it when he believed he was not. One afternoon, they argued over how evaluators should respond when a dog suddenly stopped moving. Daniel wanted language strong enough to prevent handlers from increasing pressure. Matthew wanted the rule to remain simple enough to be followed in stressful situations. They rewrote it 6 times before Daniel finally pushed the page across the table. At the top was a single sentence. When a dog stops responding, the handler must stop first. Matthew read it twice. "It won't cover every situation," he said. "No rule does." Matthew signed beneath it. Daniel added his name beside Matthew's, not as forgiveness and not as friendship, but as 2 men agreeing that the next frightened creature deserved a better interruption than either of them had received.
At home, Piper and Milo continued becoming themselves. They had separate beds, separate bowls, and separate training schedules. Some nights, Piper curled against Milo until their black and tan bodies became difficult to distinguish. Other nights, she occupied most of the sofa while Milo chose the rug beside the window. Matthew no longer moved their beds closer to reassure himself that they were bonded. He did not interpret Milo's distance as rejection or Piper's closeness as proof that he had earned permanent trust. Affection was not a score, and belonging was not a performance reviewed each evening. One quiet night, rain tapped softly against the porch roof while lights from Liberty Bay trembled across the dark water outside. Matthew rested on the sofa with Milo occupying nearly the entire pillow beside him. Piper lay near his boots, carefully removing the lace from his left shoe with the determined patience she had once refused to apply to anything. Matthew reached toward the wooden metronome on the shelf. He had not used it in months, though he had never thrown it away. The polished wood still held the memory of the house as it had been, silent, controlled, and frightened of interruption. He wound the mechanism and set it on the table. Click, tock, click. Milo opened his eyes. Piper stopped chewing. Matthew watched the brass arm move once more, then reached out and stopped it. Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of an empty house. Milo released a deep breath and closed his eyes. Piper resumed her suspicious work on the shoelace. Rain brushed the roof, and the distant glow of the harbor shifted across the window. Matthew's life had not become perfectly ordered. The clinic's trial funding might not be renewed. Daniel might never forgive him. Piper would probably continue stealing left shoes until the footwear industry developed an effective defense. Milo would still have difficult days when an unexpected sound made the world feel unsafe. Yet the house was no longer measured by how completely every living thing obeyed the same rhythm. It was measured by whether each one could pause, retreat, approach, or remain without fearing that love would be withdrawn. No one inside had to become easier to deserve a place there, and for Matthew, Piper, and Milo, that was enough of a home to begin again. Matthew believed strength meant pushing forward, but Piper and Milo taught him that real strength sometimes means stopping, listening, and allowing another soul to choose its own pace. People often judge too quickly. We call someone difficult when they are overwhelmed, weak when they are frightened, or ungrateful when they cannot yet trust our kindness. We offer help, then become impatient when healing does not follow our schedule. Yet love is not proven by how quickly another heart responds. It is proven by whether we remain gentle when progress is slow. Perhaps that is where God's miracles are often found. Not only in dramatic rescues, but in the quiet second before an angry voice softens, a controlling hand lets go, or a frightened creature finally takes one voluntary step forward. God may not erase every scar, but He can use those scars to protect someone else from being wounded the same way. May we learn to give others space without abandoning them, guidance without controlling them, and love without demanding proof in return. Please share this story with someone who needs its message. Tell us what Piper and Milo taught you in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of hope. May God bless your home, protect those you love, and bring peace to every heart still learning to trust.